Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson, and today on Tomes of Magic, I was planning on talking about unmitigated evil. But Terry said to me, Adam, why don't you just leave your personal life out of this and we talk about Book of the Fallen? So Book of the Fallen it is. And before we get to it, though, I was going to open it up for announcements. And I actually do have an announcement myself this week. Terry and I got together a few days ago to try and record this episode, and the audio equipment just was not working. We narrowed it down to my microphone. It was just not doing the job. And so we were able to order a new one. In a couple of days it came in and we can get back to recording. And I just want to say a big thank you to the executive producers that make those kind of decisions very easy for us to make so that the show can, in fact, go on. So Terry, did you have any announcements this week?
My only disappointment is that we figured that out midway through our recording of Gods and Monsters. So the audio on that one is a little bit rough, but this one came out after it. So you already know that. My only other note is I put together my schedule for Gen Con. If you're a listener and you plan on going to Gen Con in Indianapolis, Indiana, feel free to reach out to me through the Discord if you'd like to try and run into each other. It was a weird cross-section of things. The first 9 games I requested to join were all full, but the next 6 we're okay. So if all works well, I'll be trying Wraith for the first time among a smattering of other things. That's all for me.
Yeah, I'm excited. In about a week or two here, I'm heading to North Texas RPG Con up near Dallas. So there should be a lot of RPG fans there. I met some World of Darkness fans there last time I attended, so I'm looking forward to it. So, all right, today on Tomes of Magic, we are talking about Book of the Fallen from Mage 20. It came out in 2019. It had 2 authors, Satiros Bricado and Jacqueline Brick. It clocks in at 223 pages, all about the very evil Nephandi, and it gives you a content warning at the beginning of the book that this is, in fact, going to deal with evil as is appropriate for the subject. So, Terry, can you start us off with a walkthrough?
Before we get to the introduction, we get the author's preface of Evil is Not a Toy. And the author more or less opens with a list of bad things that they have personally experienced. This book indicates then that it will not be giving us a player's guide to the Nephandi, nor will it present a cartoonish kind of evil. I take this as the author saying that they have made personal contact with what they consider to be evil, so for them this is not a entirely hypothetical thing. To some extent, I guess this is kind of to prepare the reader for what they see after, and then it goes on to the introduction, Eaters of the Week. The introduction is entitled Eaters of the Week, and the first thing I noticed before we even got to the text is the fact that for the introduction, the chapter header before and after this chapter was done by Samuel Araya, and I think this is their first World of Darkness work. Samuel Araya is a noted painter and illustrator and has done a number of things for Pelgrane Press, and I was just glad to see them in the list of artist credits. This introduction indicates that the Nephandi are winning. This makes me ask then, what does being the current winner of the Ascension War mean, or what does it mean being in pole position? I'd say they're gaining power compared to the rest of the gaming world, but this by no means suggests that they're the dominant faction, nor have they won over most mortals. To me, this is more of a statement that their power comparatively has increased. I would say that the technocracy wants to control sleepers, the tradition wants to unleash them, and the Nephandi wants to distract them, and they are very distracted. It makes a comment about the Nephandi being gone in Revised, and this is a strong reversal of that. The Nephandi here are set up to represent the draw of mankind towards annihilation. We then get a sidebar commenting on what clinical sociopathy is, where someone lacks an internal sense of empathy, but may or may not act on it, versus what the author then calls sociopathy chic, who are people who choose to toss out emotion and empathy for profit. I have difficulty with these definitions. There's kind of this arbitrary line that is repeatedly drawn throughout the book as to what these things mean, which of them are clinical and which are not, and it begins in this introduction. We learn that the Nephandi are going towards a kind of dark transcendence where they seek godhood, that they see the world in terms of being either predator or prey, and that they excel at the cost of others and try to crush hope. This book says hope is absurd. We then get a section on what abuse is as a systematic pattern of dependence, isolation, exploitation, threats, damage, and fear, and that no one is exempt from it. We then get basic information on recognizing abuse when it is happening and how to hopefully escape from it. We get a few other definitions, and then we get a pretty long Nephandic lexicon that spans several pages. A bunch of these are never really brought up again. Most of the definitions provided here are consistent with what we have received before. This continues with the definition of an Aswad as being kind of an archmage or oracle. The Geledians are again quite powerful as opposed to merely teachers and guides. And then the chapter ends. Adam, what did you think about the introduction?
Yeah, this was one of the larger introductions, so there was a lot more content in there than I've been accustomed to from a number of past mage books. There's a definition of abuse, its techniques, and how to fight it. I don't think this is really so helpful to me when I'm running role-playing games. Breaking the power of abuse, there's a section on how you do that. But this section doesn't mention what to do if the abuser has Mind 3 or Entropy 2 or anything like that. So it was a little odd for me. But other than that, I'm ready for Chapter 1.
Chapter 1 is entitled The Awful Truth. In the same way Chapter 5 of M20 Core adopts an in-world voice, so does this chapter. The opening section is entitled Enough, and there's an aside entitled Drinking from a Broken Glass. The author is kind of presenting their view of things, indicating the Nephandi are trying to get people to drink from a broken glass that is filled with sewage, and we should choose not to. I would have liked this as a continuing section where there were periodic asides to kind of temper that in-world voice, which to me gets remarkably excessive at certain points. This section, again, goes through kind of all the bad things in the world of darkness, and the author goes through a narrow section of the city and lists all of the evils that are there. This is arguably the bleakest description I have seen of the world of darkness, and it is simply a list to fill your game with despair. The Nephandi believe they kind of have the straight dope on reality, and they are right to wish themselves to free themselves of its carnage. It indicates that the cult of the Star Squid doesn't exist and is a ruse, which it then later does talk about some of the cosmic entities that they truck with. And this is one of many cases within the book where it has that kind of internal consistency. It presents a definition of demon as a class of spirits that have been collectively denounced by humanity, but that the Nephandi are willing to truck with. We also get a few other key terms that are mentioned to us. We get an idea of the lex predatorius, which is the law of the predator, the right of the predator to consume the prey. We get the idea of the Leviathan, just the ability to consume all and define and control reality. We get a brief mention on what the calls are, and then the chapter kind of ends with another section where the lead character says a whole bunch of mage terms in scare quotes and then calls you an idiot for believing them. I did not enjoy that tone. I don't think it accomplishes anything, and it makes it difficult to run. The voice of the character is not compelling, which, if that is the intent as a way of encouraging people not to take on the Nephandic way, you have either presented the Nephandi as being facile, as in something that you would not legitimately be able to show in-game why people are attracted to it, or you've kind of set up a scenario where it is trivial to triumph over. And this book says that the evil presented will not be cartoonish, and to me that is one of the hallmarks of cartoonish evil. We then move on to Chapter 2. So what did you think about Chapter 1, Adam?
Well, this kind of in-character rant about how the universe is completely awful, it can be interesting, but if stretched out too long, like it is here, it gets old fast. Also, I noticed something on page 36, which really stood out to me. It states that the calls, these sort of cosmic organic devices that Nephandi go through as part of their full initiation into a Nephandi group, it states that those who aren't truly committed to becoming Nephandi will die and they will not come out of that call alive again. This, for me, is very important because there are several points in the in different World of Darkness games where they put something in the game specifically to justify, how this is going to work. For example, Vampire Masquerade. It's like how vampires have been hiding really well for hundreds of years. How do they do that? Well, when they bite someone and they take blood, then after they're done, they lick the wound and the puncture marks fade away. They're just gone. So it's like this is a specific trick vampires can use to keep their presence secret. And so it's like you read that, it's like, well, if they can do that, then yeah, maybe I can go along with this. Maybe they can stay secret. And so with the Nephandi, we have a group of villains in the world of mage who are very evil. Every faction of mages, other than the Nephandi themselves, want to kill them on sight. Their aura is warped with evil influences. So how come they haven't been infiltrated? How come they haven't been shut down? How can they keep being so evil and effective at the same time? And so this is one of those things. If a mage wants to infiltrate the Nephandi and learn all their secrets and report afterwards to prove that they're the real deal, they have to go through the call. Well, that kills them. So now it is very, very hard to infiltrate the Nephandi and leak out their secrets. And so this is covered, and I think it was covered in past editions of Mage also. So I like the fact that this book is aware of the fact that Nephandi need to keep out infiltrators, hide their auras, do all these things to remain a viable villain group in the game.
Chapter 2 is entitled Leviathan. We get another attempt to define the difference between cartoon and real evil, indicating that the line between the two is its obviousness and its trappings. I feel this is messy because it depends on the reader having a certain notion of what is obvious and what appropriate trappings are. For instance, a hermetic bedecked in robes of their station to invoke a ritual is fine, but apparently the same mage as Barabbas is cartoony. Almost any Barabbi, which is to say a mage that already had awoken under another tradition, lowercase t, and then gone through the calls, but kind of kept their way of magic, but inflected it in some darker evil way, is going to be seen as cartoony. We then get some discussion of the types of evil. This is kind of useful. We get natural evil, which is the suffering necessary for life to continue, or the harm that comes from natural processes like disasters. Some primitive Nephandi consider themselves to be natural forces, a alien evil, being whose moral compass is so different they do evil without intending, such as the Ramas Ka. Could this be mages, if you view the ability to manipulate reality as putting you beyond the moral opprobrium or being another type of entity? It could fit within this. Metaphysical evil, a type of malignant force. They also mention theological evil, which posits a cosmic force of bad. It then skips over the problem of evil, which I think would be absolutely fascinating, which is the idea that if you have a power in reality that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, how do you have, quite simply, bad things? And we've never had a World of Darkness discussion of theodicy in Mage. You have cultural evil, which is when another culture has traits requiring harm to be delivered unto them, that it is just to cause harm to a person or group of people because of a certain set of traits that they have. This is fine, except for the definitions, as with many of the definitions of this book, are not sufficiently circumspect, because in here this would indicate that, for instance, a culture with the death penalty, even for heinous crimes, is committing a kind of, has deemed the other person to be culturally evil. We then get circumstantial evil, which says that some things are okay if the why of why they're done is acceptable, and then we get personal evil, which is harm for its own sake. There is an aside that attempts to define psychopathy, sociopathy, narcissism, and sociopathy chic, which is a term, to the best of my knowledge, which is literally only used in this book. This I find somewhat bothersome in that it does something where it presumes empathy is important. The book does not do a good job, for instance, of differentiating between empathy and compassion, where empathy is the ability to understand and feel what others feel. Compassion is the desire to alleviate the suffering of others, which to me is vastly more important. Empathy can be crippling, whereas compassion is empowering, and it also fails to understand that in a lot of cases, highly abusive people are highly empathetic. They know exactly what the other person is going through, and they may like it. So just the discourse on definitions and such, I don't think was developed enough to really set a foundation for what the rest of the book describes. The next section is entitled Descent, which is the process of removing limitations on action that the Nephandi believe is holding them back. To their view, the world has held them back, and through pursuing pleasure or destruction, they will gain power. At the end of the path, the Nephandis may merge with the void and be absorbed into the pre-light non-existence, or pursue a far greater state. Other Nephandi pursue global dissension and wish to offer a feast to their dark masters, and they hold humanity in contempt. Those who dwell beyond the stars may be beings that have transcended reality and now live in their own realms far away. Others may make sacrifices to join them, and this is a case where I am bothered by the fact that they say, hey, those who dwell beyond the stars, when earlier they're like, this cult of the star squid is gone. Okay. The next part talks about what the Nephandic ideals are, and this breaks down kind of in the middle, but these were the ones that I was able to grab. These are the steps that generally seem to mark the descent into being a Nephandis, that there is a moment of awareness, some sort of knowledge that very bad things happen in the world, as well as some familiarity with the occult, some sort of conflict, this sort of phase of fighting in conflict with authority. Some sort of mentor may emerge. They may have an encounter with a Qlipoth, the abandoned shells of previous attempts at creation, except for they still have inhabitants. Exposure, the discovery of the lex predatorianus. You are a predator, the world is your prey, eat or be eaten. There are documents called abyssal litanies, the set of behavior, stories, and culture passed on from Nephandis to Nephandis, usually within a labyrinth being a place where Nephandi gather, mostly outside of civilized areas where they carry on their deeds, described as messy, and often they will amass a rival of some sort. Resolution, once the character realizes that they must achieve power or perish. Perish in this case may be to simply die or to slide off-world. Other kind of operate in a set of places at the edge of reality. They often enter damnation when they die, where they are tormented eternally. This makes them quite cautious. As mentioned, Nephandic Gilgul, which is interesting as it's quite hard, and I don't know how a bunch of Nephandi would get together to coordinate that, but it kind of suggests that ultimately, in some way, the Nephandi are a weird kind of right and wrong, in that if they do die and they do go to some sort of eternal torment, that does kind of implicitly to me recognize that the universe thinks they are wrong, rather than the universe being willing to embrace their quest for the void. We get the idea of the Ha-Rath Karo, which is a kind of demonic language which the Nephandi use to commune with dark beings, as well as a way of one-upping each other. We then get a discussion of the kind of types of Nephandi, and they often awaken during a period of victimhood. We get the idea of the Barabai, which are Nephandi that convert from other magical groups because the other group does not meet a need of some sort. We get the Caulborn, who awaken when they step through the calls. We get the Widderslancha, who could be reborn avatars, they could be alien creatures, or they could be something else. They are born in some way tainted or bad. They can turn back, and this very much relies on the fact that the avatar and the person are not necessarily the same thing, but to go against what the call of your avatar is for your entire life is somewhat difficult. We then get the Nephandic essences. We have chaotic, which ties to primordial, which seeks to return to primordial chaos. They are drawn towards storms. We have the destructive essence, which is the Nephandic version of dynamic. They tend to be volatile. Frozen ties to static. They are cold and emotionless. And tormented ties to questing, where they are unsettling or guilty. We then get a section on the laws of predation. And this is kind of a generic set of tactics that they use. We get the idea that kind of cornerstone to this is indulgence of a target, further deception, isolation, escalation, corruption, and then finally a moment of force. It then goes through some tactics that people actually use. It goes over alpha-ing, gaslighting, flying monkey-ing, I guess that's a verb now, love bombing, undercutting, and repentance kind of as a cycle. And then it comes to the end. What did you think about Chapter 2, Adam?
I appreciate the fact that Mage 20 clearly states the evil of the Nephandi as a conscious moral choice. Earlier editions of Mage, especially the first two, like early editions of Werewolf the Apocalypse, state evil is like this kind of substance that someone can pour on you, and then you're just irredeemably evil from then on. And that just never sat well with me. But this book actually says, no, that there's moral agency here. The choice was made. It's not something that somebody poured on you. Page 46 talks about the death of empathy. Nephandi are defined as those who do evil because they want to, they choose to. This I think is not necessarily brand new for Mage 20, but it is a new focus. Previous editions of Mage focused more on them serving evil beings from the Deep Umbra or seeking the end of the universe. The Nephandi-only language, it has that new name that Terry gave you that I have a hard time remembering. Previously, it was called Dragon's Tongue. And that gets a new treatment in this book. In early editions of Mage, Dragon's Tongue was something that only people who went through the call could learn and speak and understand. There was something kind of magical about it. Other mages just could not learn Dragon's Tongue, period. And in my own games, I disregarded that. I said, no, it's something different. Here, this new treatment of Dragon's Tongue states that it is not magically only for people who go through the calls, but it is a custom mixture of very old languages. And not only that, but there's a sort of interpretation code that you have to learn in person from being with other Nephandi. And the reason for that is when non-Nephandi get a hold of documents and books from the Nephandi that are written in Dragon's Tongue, it doesn't matter if they decipher the mixture of ancient languages. There's still some knowledge that would help a person interpret it, and they don't have that. So basically, the Nephandi can keep their written documents secret because of this. And so I actually like this new treatment of Dragon Tongue. I think that makes more sense to me. It's something I could more easily run with as a storyteller. I really like the new take on Widderslancha. In first edition of Mage, Widderslancha were mages who were just born evil. They were born that way, they're just going to be evil, and that's just how it is, and the faster other mages take them out, the better. Here it says that Widderslancha are mages that are born with a, I guess, tainted or mixed up avatar, and it strongly pulls them towards evil, but they still have moral agency. They can still choose to resist it. It's harder for them than it is for most people, but that choice is still there, and so I found that more interesting to use them as NPCs if I'm a storyteller. There are 6 pages defining different varieties of evil and psychology terms. I thought it was just unnecessary. I don't think this helps me as a storyteller. In this chapter, we are presented with these sort of, I guess you could say, ethical or sort of spiritual views of the Nephandi, how they understand themselves and what it is they're doing. As we'll see in Chapter 3, there are new internal factions of Nephandi who are much more modern and less spiritual and religious. And so I think in Chapter 2 it would have been really nice if we were given a non-moral, non-spiritual view of needing to end the universe, because that would fit much better with these newer, more modern Nephandi groups. But that wraps up my thoughts on Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 is entitled But Darkness Visible, and this is a big old list of who's in Nephandi. And when I think of lists of who's in who, I think of factions. And when I think of factions, I think of Adam.
Well, let's see. The Nephandi internal factions for Book of the Fallen. In Mage 20, there are 8 factions within the Nephandi. 3 are very old, while 5 are recent additions. The Outsiders, those who serve powerful beings in the Deep Umbra, are not in Mage 20. First, the old factions. These 3 groups are known to most mages, but what mages don't know is the influence of these 3 groups over Nephandi society is less than it used to be. First off, Infernalists are a collection of sects that treat with infernal beings. Now the group has more unawakened members than true Nephandi and is watching their influence decline. These Nephandi are methodical and organized. They take their traditions seriously. Longtime signature character Jody Blake is an Infernalist. Next up, Kalasha are a group that dispense with conventional notions of sanity. Mages outside the Nephandi wonder if they are a fusion of Nephandi and Marauders. The majority of members operate on an individual basis and live in secluded places or on the fringe of society where no questions are asked. They have a frightening ability to gather unawakened followers and become cult leaders to them. Malfians serve the worm, an aspect of the cosmic void. They believe the universe is inherently sick, and the only remedy is to aid the worm in its attempt to erase existence. The worm's urges are exemplars of various aspects of the void, and are like gods to the Malfians. This group emphasizes global extinction, so their members spend less time on personal dissension. They work in organized cells that include multiple Nephandi, unawakened servants, and often the Fomori and corrupted werewolves of Werewolf the Apocalypse are involved as well. There are 5 new factions. Few mages outside the Nephandi have heard these names. Baffies, also called Goat Kids, are a growing group who have attached themselves to the new festival culture. They travel to counterculture events where they present themselves as interesting people to know and build relationships with members of many different subcultures. They embrace the god form of Baphomet and engage in the darker corners of the occult while avoiding satanic trappings. Those chronicles featuring Nephandic infiltration of the 9 traditions or the disparates will have the Baffies at the front of that effort. This may be the largest faction of Nephandi in terms of awakened members. Xyzs, also called Obliviates, are mostly technomages who are dedicated to causing large-scale disasters. They seldom cooperate with each other and have no hierarchy. In fact, they undercut each other's efforts, which has led to the failure of many of their schemes. Heralds of Basilisk are internet-savvy Nephandi who are working to increase the power of an online god form called the Basilisk. They have influence in high-tech industries and cutting-edge online spaces where they encourage people to fear or just think about Roko's Basilisk. They are investing effort into restricting and taking over sectors on the digital web. The group has a leader and hierarchy, so it is more organized than most Nephandi groups. Iron Hands, also called the Tech Nephandi, use machines to create misery and work towards the world's end. Focusing more on mechanical than computer or network technology, the Iron Hands tell their new recruits they've been around since the Renaissance. They were behind the creation of many fearsome weapons of war and helped bring about both world wars. They continue to encourage armed conflicts across the globe today. At times they work together with the Xyzs and often with the Mammonites, another faction we'll cover in a minute. Those chronicles featuring Nephandi infiltration of the technocracy will have the Iron Hands at the front of that effort. Mammonites are the syndicate of the Nephandi. There isn't much more to say about them, really.
Yeah.
This group started with people from rich European families who turned their boredom into a penchant for torturing peasants in the 1700s. If you want to split hairs, I can tell you syndicate members are usually more hardworking than Mammonites, but that's really it. Okay, my thoughts on these factions. The new Nephandi groups, aside from the Baffies, support Mage 20's idea that more modern, less supernatural Nephandi can make equally frightening villains. Unfortunately, the justification for why the Xyzs haven't destroyed the world yet makes them look comically inept. A storyteller using them will have to work to avoid making them look silly. I don't believe most Nephandi would avoid the internet, especially after past Mage supplements, so I'm having trouble seeing how the Heralds of Basilisk can keep their activities secret from other Nephandi groups. As a storyteller, the Mammonites aren't all that interesting. They seem like just another expression of the author's anger over news headlines. The dark luminaries at the end of each section gives storytellers potential story ideas, so I'm glad they were included. Saying the 5 new factions are unknown even to most Nephandi is stretching things a little too far for me. Nephandi pass through calls, and there are only so many of those. A faction of mages can't get good access to calls without alerting other Nephandi. That was something I think is worth thinking about. But Terry, what were your thoughts on the internal factions of Chapter 3?
It's kind of interesting, as you mentioned, the Xyzs do kind of wind up being these comic book characters. It does allow you to create a game where most of what the technocracy is doing is stopping these extinction attempts or something similar, and it is one of those things where, oh man, with a little bit of magic, you really could hork things up for a lot of humanity with a great degree of success, which kind of makes it a world of darkness where things aren't necessarily worse, but there are a lot of super powerful bad people that need to be opposed by a lot of super powerful good people, or at least people that want to stop them. And kind of when I read through the new groups that were introduced, it's like, oh, the Iron Hands, that's like Iteration X, but evil. Oh, the Mammonites, that's like the Syndicate, but evil. Oh, the Xyzs, that's like the Progenitors, but evil. Oh, the Goat Kids, it's like the NWO, but evil. It's just like...
Yeah, I can actually see that now.
We didn't get an evil Void Engineer, so unless that's the Heralds or something like that. Mage periodically produces these sentences that accidentally change the entire game, like the one earlier that I said that hope is absurd. No, it's not. It's entirely reasonable. But the one on the Goat Kids where it says they're by far the largest faction, and then it mentions that most of them are under 30, that means your average Nephondus globally is a Burning Man going goat kid. And I don't know about you, that really changes what the Nephandi are on average, especially if they are the largest faction, and apparently these factions are unknown. So now the Nephandi are secretly being run by goat kids, who are mostly white people seemingly under the age of 30. And this to me is almost a plot hook, in that you could have your character like Jodie Blake talk to your characters and being like, yeah, the Nephandi have secretly been overrun by goat kids and we need to stop them because they're stupid. If you want to have your parody game or something like that, I'd run that. I think a bunch of the ideas are kind of interesting. The Heralds of Basilisk, it is a weird, purposeful misinterpretation of the thought experiment of Roko's Basilisk. I do like the idea that they are just trying to will a demon god into existence. We then later get the stats for the demon god. Put it this way, of all the Nephandic overlords to put me up against, I'll go up against the Basilisk. Just give me a shotgun and maybe the 10th and 11th spheres of shotgun and cocaine, and I think we could take care of this. Mates of Podcast does not encourage illicit drug use. This is strictly for the purposes of game system explanation. And I think I would be fine. I do kind of miss the Decadenti, which I think are what the Mammonites are now. Just kind of a group of very high-class people who have sold themselves over to dark powers for either money or power or influence, or just because it seems to be fun. I did like the sample characters they gave. It is reasonable that you could drop one into a game. I wish M20 were in a position to continue using those characters. It is also the case, though, that now we have more named Nephandi in M20 than we do any other faction of almost literally anything. But that is going to be the side effect of this. The art in this section was fine. It was all Michael Gato stuff, that semi-photographic, slightly modified style. And that brings me to the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is entitled Dark Tree of Knowledge. And this is a chapter explaining worldview. And we're going to start out with a few kind of basic terms. One is the night side, which is the metaphorical path of descent described. The Clipoth are the paths of the paths that lead us from savagery to godhood by navigating the abandoned shells of previous realities or these umbral realms that may just be a reflection of the dark side of creation. We get a couple of different definitions of what it could be. The chapter leans heavily on Jewish mysticism, and then we get a thing that says, is this stuff real? And it's like, sort of. The fact that the large evil faction in the game takes Jewish mysticism straightforward is something I am wildly uncomfortable with. Of all the times to just make something up, this is it. When NATO runs war games, the bad guys in it speak Esperanto. That way no one can be accused of being the bad guys. And NATO does that. Just make something up. So with that warning out of the way, we get the path through the night side. And this is a journey through Jungian psychology. So put your Jung pants on. The night side is something that is not supposed to be cognitively understood. It is commonly practiced among some, not among others. They mention left-handed practices which go against societal norms, whether it be drug use or using sexual or ecstatic states or something like that. And they mention that, hey, this is something that the Hermetics and the Cultists of Ecstasy and the Dream Speakers and the Verbena are certainly comfortable doing. And then it says, this is kind of where the Nephandi start. They first begin by exploring the Jungian shadow, where you choose to deny light. A society as a whole, or humanity as a whole, will also have a shadow containing all the possible malignant elements, as well as containing the possibility of divinity. Further into the darkness, we have the wilderness, which is a liminal zone where darkness tumbles into chaos. Some groups like the Verbena and the Dream Speakers are willing to be here, and the virtual adepts are willing to create a virtual version of this. This is where the Nephandi try and make their home, and this is where labyrinths are built. This is interesting as a section because it talks about these places both metaphorically, but also indicates that they tie to literal places, that you can find this chaos, and that is where labyrinths are built. Beyond the wilderness is the underworld. This is a place where all things break down and return to their base energies. This is the moment you step into the calls. The underworld is a place of pain, and escaping it requires help or seemingly insurmountable effort. Next, we have the depth, which is the place of the absence of light, feeling, and form. These are usually umbral realms, but they can can also be represented as deep sea or the space. Prior editions, suggest this is where the Nephandi fled or were forced to in times of weakness, but more accurately, many masters simply choose to make this place their home. Beyond the depths, we have the void, the furthest of the night side, anti-life, or extinction. This is a place where once you go there, you never go back. Here you are a god. There is nothing beyond. The next section is called the Clip Oath, Plumbing the Night Side. The night side is composed of a set of shells notionally containing the thing God did not want humanity to know. This may be previous attempts at creation or things God itself does not understand. The idea is once you climb this inverse tree of knowledge that you come out the other side in some sort of universe and transcend the flawed cosmos through self-divinity. There's an aside indicating that Nephandi can sometimes choose to enter a seeking or that they can be drawn into one, and I don't know that we have an example where failing in your awakened life can cause a seeking, but that idea is presented here. We get a mapping between spheres and different shells, as well as what each shell represents. We also get the idea shells are something that you pass through in a metaphorical sense while doing seekings. I'm not going to go through the specifics, again, be the fact that it draws from real-world terminology so directly and is actively perverse as to their interpretation. Just know that the realms themselves are kind of interestingly described. I would feel perfectly comfortable picking them up and putting them somewhere else after doing a little bit of reskinning. Most of them are ruled over by an entity and have some sort of theme that they reflect, whether it be greed or perverse life or the void and absence of love. I think these are actually quite well described, and the denizens put in them are somewhat interesting. In many cases, they do draw directly on real-world traditions. We get a little bit more information then on what the calls are and where they are. They note that the avatar passing through a call is not so much inverted, so much as stabilized, rearranged, and infused with energies of the void. It then goes on to say that it merges with the abyss itself. We also get the idea that a large labyrinth may have several and that they are kind of semi-organic. We also get the idea that if an unwilling person is shoved in, their soul is ruined and scattered about the cosmos, which is the first time I think we've gotten information about a soul being scattered. They are outside of time and space. Calls cannot be formed naturally or forced into existence by mages. They already exist out there, which kind of suggests that calls are natural phenomena, and I don't know how I feel about that in the same way that shallowings just kind of exist, that calls just kind of exist, and Nephandic labyrinths are built around them. They're also indicated as being things that will periodically close or open or wither for seemingly no reason, while others have been in continuous operation for several centuries. In previous editions, these were kind of indicated as being the semi-organic portal voids that go between our reality and the reality of the Dark Masters of the Nephandi, and here they're a little bit weirder. We also find out that the Clip Oath are both inner realms, a place of contemplation and reflection on the nature of evil or being or what have you, but they are also in some meaningful way out there in the Umbra, and then an astral voyager with a few dots of the appropriate esoterica could reach them. They may be realms entirely made out of the belief that they exist. They are connected to each other, but each is borderless in so much as they do not have clearly defined walls, and there is a network of tunnels between them. The thing that kind of got me is there isn't really a good reason given on why one would visit one of these places except for the purposes of a seeking. We don't get geography or location or the entities there and what they could bargain for. The controllers of the realm seem to be despotic and near total, and a little bit of information on, hey, this is something a person would actually want to go to, because if this is strictly material used for seekings, this is a lot of material that can kind of only be used for one-on-one sessions, which is fine to some extent, and we don't get the sense, though, that the demons located in these Clip Oath in any way interact with, say, the astral or high umbral quartz. The final section is entitled The Black Diamond, and it ends on a question of kind of what is perfection? What is the cosmic demiurge, and what is it to become a god? Is there a form of power beyond the Aswads? Have they touched something else? Will a Nephandic god rise to consume all of false reality? And this, to me, fits uneasily in a book that also tries to talk so heavily about mundane evil, and passing the baton between the two, and also indicating that this book is not cartoonish and the star squid doesn't exist when both are kind of constantly presented, is an uneasy tension that I don't feel the book really is able to balance. We get the idea of the black diamond, which is a perfect dark reflection of all things, which I kind of like as a metaphor. A lot of the stuff in this section I thought is quite useful. Again, I would rebrand it. The choice is mystifying to me. And now that I've repeated that statement 3 times, Adam, what did you think about Chapter 4?
Let's see, on page 94, I think it's weird to read a sidebar telling me material in an RPG book is fictional. I mean, whenever I read an RPG book, I just assume it's true. I mean, I've been setting black spiral dancer traps in my backyard every night since the early 90s. I mean, doesn't everyone? Come on.
And you've yet to be attacked by a black spiral dancer, so it is clearly working.
You know, they'll come along someday, but... But, okay, talking about Nightside in this chapter, there is a long section talking about psychology and psychology terms. This was, I'm afraid, just not interesting for me. I can't tell the difference between Jung's Long Shadow and The Wilderness. They kind of sound like the same thing, even though they're supposed to be different things. It states the wilderness is a physical place. I'm having a hard time understanding where it might be. Perhaps they just wanted storytellers to have the freedom to place it where they choose to. This description of the underworld states it is beyond facing individual and societal taboos and immoralities, which, you know, there's a connotation there that the Euthanatos would know that, and that would be a part of their practice. However, past mage books never describe this as part of the Euthanatos visiting the underworld, and so that kind of made it hard for me to really accept this information on the underworld as given. The depths and the void both look like the deep umbra. How exactly is visiting them different from regular mages going to the deep umbra? I don't fully understand that, but perhaps some other mage fans can help me out with that one. I just don't feel like the book made it properly clear to me. The Qliphoth descriptions give me ideas on using them for Nephandi seekings, but it is hard for me to use these Qliphoths for anything else. Like, for example, if the the hero player characters are trailing a Nephandi and follow them into this place, well, of course, the heroes are not going to do a seeking there at all. They're going to do something else, and in which case these descriptions don't give me a lot to work with. I would have to be doing a lot on my own as a storyteller. Page 99, Nephandi, quote, Nephandi are who and what they are, not because they do malignant things, but because they've gone diving in the embodiment of the abyss and have been transformed on a soul deep level, end quote. This stands out as kind of an odd statement to me in light of the 3 chapters I read before this. It aligns with older editions' explanation of Nephandi, but this edition emphasizes choosing evil is what defines a Nephandi. So, as Terry said, there are sections in this book that have sort of an uneasy tension where they kind of pass back and forth between 2 different ideas. This book links all Nephandi to Kabbalah at, I would say, a fundamental level. I've spoken with a Jewish mage fan online who thought that reflected poorly on Jewish culture. I can understand that view. I don't think the book expresses a negative view of Jewish culture or Kabbalah itself. The book states Jewish mystics and Nephandi noticed the same aspect of the universe long ago and developed beliefs around it. Where the book falls short is the unbelievably similar, almost identical beliefs of the Nephandi and Kabbalah. Same names, same structure, etc. Not only that, but in trying to create a unifying a set of beliefs for the quite varied sects of Nephandi, it appears to link them too closely to one real-world culture. Storytellers using this material will have to constantly remind themselves and their players that the Nephandi didn't actually split off from Jewish mystics centuries ago. I think, as Terry said, the better solution is really, this is the place to create some new material that is fictional and not connected to a real-world religion or culture. Last information on the 10 Qliphothic realms is very vague. I guess they're a state of mind, they're a realm, they're a zone. It gets pretty darn fuzzy for me. I can understand how you want to keep it mysterious, but a little more solid information for me, thinking as a storyteller, would have just been so welcome. But that wraps up my thoughts on Chapter 4.
The next chapter is entitled Chapter 5 and All the Powers of Hell. This is the Systems and Stuff chapter. It starts with a bunch of Nephandic merits and flaws with an innocuous aura. It is not easily apparent that you've gone through the calls. Abyssal Mastery, you could just kind of exist in space, and you can use Spirit 5 to step sideways directly into the Clipoth. Clipothic Radiance, you give off a notable stench of darkness. One of the more interesting ones that I would probably not have a player have, but I would certainly be fine encountering a character with it, would be Spectral Presence. You now kind of are stuck in the penumbra, and only through great exertion can you affect material reality. You don't need physical nutrition, even though you still have cravings for it. Interestingly, this is only a 3-point flaw. You're not entirely material. This is about as bad as really needing hearing aids. That's good to know. We get Abyssal Lunatic, which is a 5-point flaw, which makes you completely unplayable. And then we get Witterslant, or the Tate of Corruption, which is 7 points. And this is kind of interesting because there's two ways of presenting this. One is this would explain why Witterslant characters may be more powerful, because they just get 7 free points at character creation for having this. Or at the same time, it's one of those things which will be an all-consuming role-playing challenge for a player. We already get Taint of Corruption as a flaw in Book of Secrets. We then get some information on investments, where you can commit an atrocity for freebie points, from being mean to selling your soul. They tend to have some sort of downside as well, in that common way that agreements with demons do. And they don't really scale well, because it's one of those things where you can get a point of power by committing minor sins. And then at level 8, the hardcore sinner can destroy a city, a creed, a nation, become a warlord, or a career politician. And it's like, okay, it just doesn't have this quite scaling feature to it. It then suggests what you can get through investments, that you can gain occult wisdom, superhuman abilities, powers of great charm, and how many points of investment they take. So the idea of trading atrocities for getting something is kind of interesting, although the scale doesn't quite seem to be on par. A painful sacrifice of a living person can more or less get you an extra dot of an attribute, and that kind of is where I set the equivalence. There is then a bunch of examples given, and these are interesting ideas, but they don't give enough systems. Like Object of Affection, for 7 points, someone will just kind of love you. It is a hollow reflection of love, but it doesn't give an option for the target to resist. We don't get any system to free someone of this. And to me, someone being targeted by a Nephandic investment is great plot fodder. So some information on how to break it or how to interact with it, to me, is something that's kind of necessary. For instance, one of them is prosecutorial immunity. You will not be held within the criminal justice system. So you're like, oh, okay, there's no way to undo this. Do we just have to kill the guy then? So the idea that someone who is immune from mortal structures of formal power then needs to be taken out by an extrajudicial killing is kind of weird to me. We then get malevolent foci, which are just foci used by Nephandi. And a lot of these are just kind of methods. For instance, alternative sciences is written as a focus, but it discusses how these alternative sciences are venues for Nephandic corruption through cults and through subverting science, whether it be through nutritional supplements or something like that. That's not really a focus. That's just kind of a method, and that method to me would be more subversion, and it doesn't answer the question of how magic is actually brought into existence. That really needs to be kind of explained. Many of these things are more religious creeds than foci, and then we get a bunch of those paradigms, and you get things like cosmic horror is the only truth, everyone is against me, so whatever I do is justified. These aren't really paradigms. These are just kind of worldviews, and they don't necessarily explain where the magic done come from. Humans are terrible suggests that we are fallen and we can call on our Gaian origins to change the world, but that doesn't really feel Nephandic. It's kind of a neat idea, though. It does kind of give an idea of why Nephandi may be powerful. Their willingness to go further than everyone else and to use atrocity suggests that other people are being held back, and that forms a limitation to their magic. Again, at no point do we really get systematic support for that, with the exception of those demonic investments. We get malignant magics, which is rotes and such. These are remarkably lengthy write-ups for things that already exist. For instance, we get the Art of Seduction, which gives us a lengthy system on how to change someone's mind. This also, across the section, indicates that with Mind 2, you can get someone to do something they will do anyway. At Mind 3, you can get them to do something that they are indifferent towards. At Mind 4, you can kind of force them to do anything. And at Mind 5, you can just just rewrite who they are as a person. Some of the systems are inconsistent with previous books, like for instance that you're using the target's willpower as difficulty instead of it being a resisted roll against their willpower. We get a rote for causing a plague, which seems way more effective than summoning a storm if you want to destroy an area. This is arguably one of the most effective ways to cause widespread destruction. We get a rote on summoning egregars, which are thought entities that will do what you ask them to do. Frequently, these rotes will say it takes these spheres and maybe these 3 other spheres, and no indication is given as to why those other spheres are necessarily required. I'm quite simply not sure how to use a lot of the things in this section. They are extensions of existing rotes that we have in some cases, and in other cases they bring into existence novel systems that kind of contradict what we've gotten before. The next section is on the stuff of the Nephandi, and we get a bunch of grimoires here. We get a Sumerian tome of atrocities, we get some sort of dark urban fantasy book series that is just kind of torture porn. We get a false copy of the Precepts of Damien, which were purportedly the reason why we had purges of the other groups in the late 90s, indicating that is the Nephandi's fault. There's a book purporting to contain the 6 seals of Solomon that contain information on 6 demons, and pages themselves are blown by the wind as you read through. And I'm like, ooh, a menacing book. We get a lot of sleeper books that are in no way magical. I would like a little more advice on how to use that. Like, the secret power of the Nephandi is also revealed in this section, in that we get Nephandic weapons. Malign Cutlery is a fascinating 2+ set of wonders, and Nephandic scythes do strength +9 lethal damage. I think we know why they're winning the Ascension War. Mage has very rarely been a game of big swords, except for that brief period of time in Lore of the Traditions where they're like, you know what's cool? The traditions. You know what's cool? Swords. You know what each tradition needs? A big-ass sword. And I'm like, you know what? I'm here for it. And now we have the Nephandi counter swords, and they're effing huge. Like, the Titanic sword is roll against difficulty 5, and it does strength +8 lethal damage. Like, that can clearly cleft someone in twain. And then sometimes it's like, sometimes you have to have at least strength 2. You're like, oh, that's good. The limiting factor on using this is it can only be used by nearly everyone. That's good. But yeah, these swords, we get a lash that wears away people's willpower, a portable gate to hell. The portable gate to hell seemingly requires more dots of getting to hell than some of the other things, but it acts as kind of a get out of jail free card. And that brings us to the end of the section. And some of these are neat. Often they are either mundane technological devices or things that you could kind of create up a little system for. They're fine. I could certainly see a Nephandi using them, though. Adam, what did you think about the magic of Chapter 5?
Well, let's see, on Chapter 5, page 116, it tells us that detailed player-facing info on Nephandi makes them more fearsome. And I was wondering, well, how does that work exactly? I'm not clear on that one. Page 117, there's a merit called Innocuous Aura, and this is a really big deal. Any Nephandis who, NPC or God forbid, player character takes this merit, then their aura always looks good on every scan that other mages do on them, which means they can infiltrate any mage, non-Nephandi mage group really easily. And so, as a storyteller, every storyteller has to make the decision: are they going to allow this merit in their game, and how prevalent is it? Because this could change everything, basically. So storytellers, be aware of that one. The infernal investments, we've seen these in previous editions of Mage. Here, they focus more on social and institutional power more than physical power. So I think the authors wanted to make it clear that they don't want fireball tossing and back alley brawls. They want these infernal investments to be used more for manipulating regular sleeper institutions or getting really terrifying social advantages with other people that can lead to terrible things later. Many of the paradigms are very, very similar to ones we've seen in previous Mage 20 books, so that was a little disappointing for me. There are a number of practices that really are just duplicates of practices we've seen before, only these are evil. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, I mean, I could have made that distinction as a storyteller myself, so it's just not very helpful. It makes it clear that there are no Qlipothic spheres of magic in the Mage 20 edition. For me, that's interesting because the first 2 editions of Mage said Nephandi no Qlipothic entropy, which is like a different kind of entropy sphere, and non-Nephandi don't know it. And then Revised Edition said every sphere of magic has a Klipothic opposite, which I think is a little too much to handle. Mage 20 says there are no Klipothic spheres. Nephandi used the same kind of magic, same kind of game rules as other mages, which I think is acceptable. I don't have a problem with that. I think Klipothic entropy is pretty darn cool, but that not everybody thinks that. Okay, there is a wrote in here, Shroud the Soul, which again is a way for Nephandi to hide their aura from scans from other mages, so once again they can infiltrate a non-Nephandi group and cause havoc. Looking over the rules for this, it seems pretty darn easy. I think that would be used as the justification for the suggestions in the Mage 20 core book that the Nephandi are infiltrating large groups and doing it very successfully, and this can lead to dramatic plots. But if that's not where you're going with your chronicle, then this road, I think, is a little too easy to pull off. And also, can non-Nephandi do this, or only the Nephandi know this? I think that's worth discussing. There is a rote, every man against his brothers, where a Nephandist can manipulate a crowd to do something terrible to an opponent of the Nephandis. The low difficulties assume a very negative view of humanity here. So as a storyteller, as a mage fan, I might adjust the difficulty there. It seems suspiciously easy. There is a rote called Grasping Terrors, which is hands come out of nowhere and just grab the subject of the rote. And I was like, oh my gosh, that would just be really scary and really cool. This is like Nephandi level stuff for me. That's pretty uncool. As a storyteller, I don't want anybody doing that to me in real life. Yeah. But overall, the rotes in Chapter 5 they're more practical and they're less inspiring or interesting. I guess there was a real emphasis on let's give practical abilities that explain how the Nephandi can cause so much harm in the world of darkness. So they make sense, but not all of them are all that exciting or interesting on their own. In the devices, Terry covered a lot of those. There was one that stood out to me. There's something called the Fido Collar, which is a sort of a talisman. It's like a decorative necklace. Traditionally call it a choker. It doesn't like hang down from your neck. It adheres more closely to your neck. This is a device so that Nephandis can control slaves and force them to do things and they can't escape and all this kind of thing. I guess that makes sense in the world of darkness. It was a little too on the nose for me, and the authors seem to agree because at the end of the write-up they have a justification. It's like, no, this is taken from real life, so it makes sense. So it's like, we know that you think this looks like it's too much, but it's real, so you should have it in your game. My thinking is, as a storyteller, I'm running a fictional role-playing game for my friends. If something looks too ridiculous or looks like too much, then yeah, don't put it in the game. I'm not going to tell my players, hey, this looks ridiculous, but you're just supposed to accept it. It's like, I don't take that stance. And that wraps up Chapter 5 for me.
The next section is Chapter 6, entitled Your Friends and Neighbors. And this goes through people. We get a bunch of examples of organizations and then kind of members of that organization. A Better Sandal is a company that is seemingly about being paid to do shit posting, where you just kind of attack a celebrity or malign another business or just post nonsensical things on the internet. And we don't really get an explanation of the business model, to my mind. I was waiting to see them land that and being like, oh, they're hired to do counter intel by other companies, or they harness the quintessence generated by people shitposting and then they sell that on to something else or something like that. I'm like, oh man, this is going to be really, oh wait, it's over.
Yeah, I was actually blown away by the fact that I have written in my notes, I don't understand the business model of Better Sandal. And Terry spelled it out. It's like, yes, exactly. I can sort of understand how someone would pay someone else, but it's like, this is supposed to be a public-facing company, like with the website and brochures and stuff. It's like, how do you advertise that? And then don't get in a whole lot of trouble a couple of months down the road when, something blows over. It's like, I just can't see the pieces fitting together. But go on, Terry.
Yeah, I could see them being a PR firm that has this other branch that it's secretly two companies that are related to each other that the public doesn't know about. I do like the idea that the founders are dead and the CEO is fake, and it's just kind of this front, and that was kind of neat. We get a set of clothing lines that are trying to change the world through ThoughtSpace and their designers. I did like the idea, though, that I thought this was initially kind of lame, but I like the idea of one of the things the Syndicate does is they take the trappings of the traditions and make them look stupid in the mortal mind. This is doing the opposite. It is taking the trappings of the Nephandi and making them look cool. But at the same time, you could tell that the author has a certain amount of contempt for it. So the author is like, these people are idiots for making this look cool, even though it works because sleepers are idiots. You're not an idiot, right, reader? And you're like, wait, where are we going with this? Am I being am I being recruited into the non-semi anti-Nephandi, which I guess is a good thing? I'm not entirely sure. But I also like the fact that Adam and mine both response to a better Sandor was like, well, what's your business model? Like, it's like, Dad, I'm going out back with a saw. Wait, why? How does this work? Like, don't worry, I'll be safe. No. There's still a basic question that is yet to be answered here, and I would like an answer for it before I say it's okay. So again, the Dadcast comes through. We get a decadent club in the form of Club Maelstrom, which is this moving thing where people die, with a Fraternal Order the Shield, which is a group of law and order, quote unquote, officers who emphasize a very brutal form of order. We get a New Age Press, which is publishing Malignant Twaddle, and then we get a section entitled Earthly Servitors and Maligned Entities. We get an Imp, which can be summoned online. We get the Return of the Ramas Ka. We get a fungus that feeds on bad feelings. We get a list of goetic entities that you can summon, mimetic entities that you can invoke. We get the Basilisk, which has a whole section with 20 health levels, no soak, and a gnosis of 3. They're supposed to be a malevolent, all-knowing god, and they have an intelligence of 3. We get a bunch of Paradox Spirits, and one of the weird things here about the Paradox Spirits is frequently they are given health levels, which we don't always get. So again, it appears to be the best way of dealing with Wrinkle is with a shotgun, and that to me does not feel very mage-like. We then get fallen mages who are Nephandic characters. We get the Voice, which simply menaces you and may be a manifest avatar. We get Jane Doherty, who is a cannibal human trafficker who eats people by running a small greasy spoon diner. It's kind of an interesting over-the-top character, which I could certainly see, especially if you have a lot of other more staid or subdued Nephandi. Just having one where you're like, oh no, okay, literal cannibal. This is much easier to do. This chapter had a bunch of things that you can kind of pick through. The goetic entities were kind of neat. The illustrations, it's useful to know what these things kind of look like. The companies are all things that you could drop in a game. I probably would have liked a little more on the people running the operation, so that way I could really drop it in wholesale, which is kind of neat. We don't get write-ups for a lot of the secondary characters like the Shock Artiste and the Closet Sadist, but I see that. I don't need necessarily a full write-up of those things. I was kind of hoping for more top-level stuff. Like, one of the interesting things to me about the Nephandi is they regularly truck with very potent spirits, or at least that is what is purported. The game kind of de-emphasizes that, but one or two kind of would have been nice. The introduction of the goetic entities as creatures that you could look to for wisdom and understanding, I think is perfectly fine, and I think I'm glad that is included. Adam, what did you think about Chapter 6?
Well, a lot of things here. Towards the beginning, the Club Maelstrom, I thought it had very interesting possibilities. There's one nightclub, or dance club, I guess you could say, that opens its doors magically at defunct nightclubs in different cities across, apparently, North America or the Western world. So you can walk in Seattle, and then your players fight some opposition, and then they break out and they're in New York City. It's like, what just happened? So I think that can be interesting. The section towards the beginning of the chapter, Cults, Cliques, and Corporations, each one ends with a full write-up on a typical member or a typical person that they would employ, and that information just wasn't interesting for me. It was so typical that it's like, yeah, as a storyteller, I kind of had this in my head already, so that was not a good use of space in the book for me. Breaking out into the strange entities, the Ramas Ka, had they been mentioned before, but I just think they're cool. They're big, they're strange, they're scary. It's like some sort of a blob that dissolves people, and sometimes it even dissolves its own allies, and so it's like one of those crazy, dangerous things. It makes you wonder, are the Nephandi calling up things they can't control, which is one of the themes that comes in when you're talking about Nephandi, so it works for me. I don't really know anything about real-world occult, but I sort of grew up hearing now and then about goetic demons, and it's like, okay, these are really bad, leave them alone, so I did. But here in this book, I just think it's odd that there are two goetic demons who are actually nice guys. Once you can call them up and chat with them, and it's no big deal. Boer and Stolas, and so I was kind of wondering if that was thematically appropriate. It's like, you hear about these horrible goetic demons, and some of them really are in here, and then there are two that are just, they don't look scary. They're kind of weird guys. They show up and tell you some nice things, and they go home without causing any trouble. So it's like, I don't know if that really fits for me. But also, Baphomet. When you read the description of Baphomet, he actually kind of sounds harmless. Yet he's associated with the Nephandi sect that is not at all harmless. And so it's like, I don't think they quite struck the landing with the Baphomet write-up. I think they should have made him sound menacing because the people who are connected with him are very menacing. So that was just odd. There's one called Zagla, which I thought was actually just really cool. I mean, it was firing on all pistons for me. It's a sort of strange otherworldly entity that seems to have some kind of a liking for the digital web and computer networks and everything. And what it does is it takes images and it does a sort of digital warping of them to like turn them into something crazy. Like it would take a cartoon cat image and then like slowly warp it in front of your eyes into some fearsome, horrifying kind of a creature and then let it loose. And that's how Zagla always manifests. And so I don't know, it kind of works for me. I thought it was interesting. As a storyteller, I might like to play with that, visit that on my players. Let's see, the Nephandi have their own paradox spirits. There's one called Safin, which made a little less deadly. I think it would be a very interesting paradox spirit to use on choristers and Bettini. If I remember this correctly, it's like this blinding light that is so bright and so holy and pure that it damages people who are exposed to it because people are sinful, non-perfect individuals. And it's like if you just ratchet that down a little bit, I think that would be a very interesting paradox spirit to use on choristers and Bettini because they're trying to be good, and so this good thing shows up and harms them. It's like, whoa, am I not being good enough? And I think a storyteller could take that in interesting directions. Also, Elon Musk is named Garrick Brown in the World of Darkness, and so that was, I don't know, kind of odd. As we're recording this, Elon Musk is in the headlines a lot. A lot of people are saying good and bad things about him, so it's just kind of interesting to be reading a World of Darkness book. It's like, oh, he's Garrick Brown here. And okay, that's a choice. So that's chapter 6 for me.
Chapter 7 is entitled Theatre of Cruelty, and this is the storyteller chapter. One of the sections is entitled Playing with the Nephandi and Surviving. It goes over using emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, religious abuse, and financial abuse in a game, and kind of how to do that, and to ask your players how to navigate those things, and some advice kind of if your players are too cool with it. We then get a literal Nephandi's player's guide, the one thing they said they wouldn't give us. Yeah. So, then we get meta plot options. And this goes over not quite so much meta plot so much as kind of options. And some of these are interesting. That the Fallen are a contentious bunch of throwbacks that are kind of falling to infighting. We could have that they infiltrated the technocracy and that caused the atrocities of the 20th century. Could have infiltrated the traditions, and it explains the fighting at Dewizatep and a kind of constant low-level background war. They may have formed the traditions as kind of a metaphysical suicide cult, that they saw the rise of the technocracy and they wanted to kill off some of their opposition, so they organized them into the tradition so that they could more effectively throw themselves against the gears of war. Another option is that both the traditions and the technocracy are corrupt and it's up to the disparates. We could have the basilisk rise, maybe Cthulhu returns. Again, these are not really meta plot so much as background for the story, which again is fine. It's just a kind of a terminology thing. Get a brief aside on can the Nephandi be redeemed? I would have liked more information on how this could happen. I do think it is an interesting avenue for player versus avatar, and it really kind of shows us that the avatar is separate seemingly from the person, and if not, a little bit more information on how to run with that would have been nice. We then get an afterword where the author says, I wish I could say this Book of the Fallen is an exaggeration. It's not. Every element within the preceding book, save the outright supernatural aspects, has been drawn from real life. Slavery, terrorism, fashionable sociopathy, state-sponsored torture, corporate abuses, sexual exploitation, all of it is absolutely true. In terms of sheer human foulness, this World of Darkness is our own, and to me this is less a commentary on the World of Darkness than on our actual world. I don't think the author understands necessarily what the word exaggeration means. In M20, the line between the author and the voice of the game is often quite thin in places. And for a book like this, to try and square those two together is quite difficult. If this is the World of Darkness as purported, I don't know if this is a problem with our reality or the World of Darkness is so dark it's simply a place I don't want to play anymore. And this is beyond the sections where we have that in-character omniscient voice saying, oh, everything sucks all the time, so you better be one of the bad guys so you can win at one thing once forever. And that brings us to the end, so I guess I'll reserve my proper comments, but what did you think about Theatre of Cruelty? And I guess the afterword.
Well, let's see. There was an interesting quote on page 205. The further we move into the 21st century, the more absurd the old magic versus science conflict of Mage's early days becomes. And that's not written into the foundation of the game, yet if you look at some of the first and second edition supplements, there is some of that in there. So there is some truth to that, but not as much as first appears from reading this quote. Page 219, there won't be a moment to draw a quiet breath once this metaplot kicks in, end quote. Okay, hold the phone. That's plot, not metaplot. So when you take any metaplot and you apply it to your game and run your game is an example of metaplot, not plot. So that was a little odd, but a minor nitpick. Maybe I'm being too fussy there. There's metaplot options at the end of chapter 7, and the only one that seems new from age 20 is the Hungry God, which is basically how to take the basilisk and that's presented in this book and a metaplot option based on that, which is fairly interesting. But again, it's the only new one among a list of metaplot options. Like reading through them, it's like, yeah, Mage 20 covered that one and that one and that one. So that was a bit disappointing for me. The authors afterward, there's a call to activism. The world's a terrible place. You've got to get up and make it better. It's like, well, I guess on a certain level I can agree, but again, really this is a RPG book, so I'd rather it focus on the game that I want to run for my players when with dice and paper and pencil and all that. So I really like it when games have a better focus on what they are there for. And going into general thoughts on the book, Terry, I'd like to hear what you think about the book as a whole.
I would have liked some information on dialing the type and level of evil in the world, because if you take everything here all at once as presented, it is a remarkably evil world that is overrun by Nephandi, and have a game that is focused on literally anything else seems like it would be missing the point. It uses werewolf terminology a lot, and so does M20 as a whole. Between that and the introduction of actually having souls as things, I really think this makes the world less interesting, in the same way that I don't want Jewish mysticism to be the canonical truth of the cosmos that all the bad people use. I don't want the werewolf view of the Weaver, Wild, and Worm running around with Fomori being a major nemesis in the game. The attempts at literary flourishes to me actively impede the message. The voice that is used for some of the early chapters, which is then later dropped, I think makes it confusing. I think there was a fundamental organizational issue in a lot of cases where Adam and I talked about how we thought the paradigms weren't really paradigms. They were either rehashings or they were just kind of worldviews. And to me, that's fine. Just call it that. Have a worldview section and be like, hey, here are some things that can happen to characters that cause them to turn into Nephandi. It conflates the abuse done by those for pleasure with that which is done out of lack of care, with that which is done out of negligence. I would argue that the largest cause of harm to people is not others being actively malignant so much as setting up systems where harm to others is rewarded. It is far easier to, let's say accidentally, I say with some air quotes, to create crappy environmental regulation that can cause harm to literally millions than it is to create a child trafficking ring for personal gain. I think the former is much closer to what we will encounter in the real world, and its ability to scale and cause misery is not to be trifled with. And that kind of institutional evil is quite simply ignored. Evil in this book occurs because there is a malignant actor who actively wants to harm other people or chooses actively not to care. And to conflate those two, I think, is foolish. There is a critical level at which harm done by large institutions and systems of power is indeed cruelty and evil, but I think that is way harder to notice, and having a conversation around that to me is much more interesting, and that's how you can have the technocracy be so destructive in the pursuit of order. Sometimes we get page references to previous books, other times we don't. Towards the end of the book, we get flat out spelling errors. These are words that are just spelled wrong that in Word would have a red squiggly line underneath them. We get formatting inconsistencies. It just kind of falls off at the end. And then we have the fundamental tension inside of the book between comic book evil, a very mundane kind of evil, a kind of supernatural evil, and the any other manifold forms. I would have much preferred saying there is a variety of types of evil and the Nephandi move between all of them rather than saying they aren't this. And we talked about the tension between the cult of the Star Squid purportedly being gone and then us getting information about the Cult of the Star Squid, which I would have liked more information on. I like that stuff. I find it interesting. One of the things about mage is, along with werewolf, is the literal can become figurative and the figurative can become literal. And if you want a massive embodiment of evil out in the cosmos, mage is a game where that can happen. Are you going to be able to attack it with a starship or something and bring light and truth to the cosmos? Probably not. But if you wanted to picked it, it is there. There is some genuinely good stuff in this book. It is creative and it is interesting. The information on abuse and such, I think it would have been more useful to have that tie directly into what the Nephandi use and to kind of give a few trails of how that happened, which is interesting because previous books in the Nephandi, the revised Book of the Fallen, do go through that. The art in many cases is somewhat unsettling, so mission accomplished there. And that is kind of my thought on this somewhat complicated book. Adam, what did you think?
Let's see. The new idea in this book that Nephandi want to become gods is good and fits with the idea in later editions of Mage that some mages seek to become god forms. What I don't agree with is the notion that this makes them more frightening than mages who serve evil gods. Evil gods could be eons old with greater power than a mage who became a god 200 years ago can muster. I don't see either option as being more menacing than the other. The interesting hook for your own stories is the notion that Nephandi have long been better at producing god forms than other factions. Now mages have another reason to seek out Nephandi and risk coming under their influence. Twice this book mentions Sun Wukong, the Monkey King from Journey to the West. It's an older Chinese work of fiction. It says that Sun Wukong is an incarnation of evil that Nephandi like seriously follow. And this doesn't work for me on two levels. First, it's like telling someone that Donald Duck is a demon from hell. Second, it misses the point of the character. The Monkey King is a representation in fiction of the common man's desire to thumb his nose at authority and get away with it occasionally. And that's all. It's really nothing darker. The Monkey King goes nuts early in the story but doesn't do any permanent damage. He soon becomes a supporter of religious and social order who occasionally pranks someone. And that's it. So this is just such a wild misinterpretation of this character that it's just, as someone who knows a little bit about Chinese culture, I was reading through it going, no, I can't roll with this. The many references to how do you do that makes it clear that book is necessary. I don't think of it as a supplement. It's necessary for running Mage 20. There was a faction or group of Nephandi called the Gatekeepers mentioned in the Mage 20 core book, and they seem to be a happening, powerful group in Nephandi circles. They weren't really mentioned in here. I thought that was a weird omission. I really like the idea of the outsiders from the early days of Mage. They serve unknowable beings in the deep umbra. For me, initial assumptions are important. If you start with the assumption that outer beings aren't real, then yeah, they look really darn silly. But if they are real in your setting, then it makes sense they would look for awakened agents on Earth. And again, as Terry said, it states clearly a few times in this book that, yeah, we're not doing that. That's even pretty dopey. But then at other places, like, no, this is happening. And so it's like, yeah, I don't know really how this book wants to make a stance on that. But for me, as a storyteller dealing with Nephandi, I think it's helpful to pick one guiding theme for what defines the Nephandi. Is it really evil mages? Is it mages who have gone through the calls? Is it mages who serve evil beings? Is it mages who are trained by a specific faction or society and are influenced by them? That helps me so much as a storyteller to guide what are Nephandi really about. Is it just someone who went through a call and now they're different and that's what's going on with them or something else? That's what helps me to make sense of the different depictions of Nephandi over 4 different editions of Mage, because someone just coming in and looking through Mage books, it's like, well, what are the Nephandi? It's like, how do I put these conflicting views of them together? It's like, well, you pick the one guiding theme for what is a Nephandi and you take it from there. Things should fall into place for you as a storyteller. There's no mention of Nephandi who believe all of their philosophies are a put-on and a fake, and only believe in pursuing selfish goals. It seemed like that should have at least been mentioned, like Nephandi who come in, they go through the call, they become a Nephandist and work with others, but the whole time they're believing, yeah, you don't believe it, I don't believe it, it's all a put on, it's all a fake, I'm just going to serve my own goals and pretend that I believe this stuff when I really don't. And it wasn't really there. This book focuses on abusers as a template for what the Nephandi are all about. That works of course, but I think there are other templates that can define nefandous villains in your game, so I don't think Abuser is the only one to use. There is a focus on real-world events and headlines in this game. Obviously, the two authors were very concerned about a lot of bad things happening in the real world. I guess I can understand that, but I wonder how much that's supposed to color a role-playing book that you're putting out for other people to use at their tables. This book repeatedly states it is not a Nephandi player's guide, and the author is against such things, but as Terry pointed out very ably, it is a Nephandi player's guide. Not only that, but it's a detailed and complete one. And so, as a Mage fan reading through that, you're going to have to figure out what you think about that. I mean, are you going to allow Nephandi player characters? You have everything you need in this book to do it. I don't do that. I don't want Marauder or Nephandi player characters. And so those sections of this book aren't helpful to me. If I'm going to run Mage 20, there's big sections of this book I'm just going to ignore because I don't have Nephandi player characters. So, when discussing this book, I can't avoid that topic. But that pretty much wraps it up for me. Is there an interesting quote for the book that stood out to you, Terry?
Yes, the book is big and had its interesting collection of lines. One of my favorites was, the explosion may be emotional, social, financial, physical even. In the case of religious and metaphysical communities, spiritual. I'm going to say that without context, and I think it is better than that, better for it. The other one was, a material creature gated in from somewhere else in the physical world demands between 2 and 20 successes. Thanks, book. So,
yeah, that stands out.
Yeah. So, what are we reading next, Adam?
Next up, it is Technocracy Reloaded, and there is so much Technocracy information in Mage 20 already that this book is going to need to justify itself to me. So I of course, haven't read it yet, so that's going to be interesting to get into for next time. But I think that about wraps it up for this episode. If you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with questions, comments, or feedback. You can subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. And hey, if you like the show and leave a review for this show, then it makes us much more visible in other people's online searches, and we would certainly appreciate that. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes and get the complete show notes that we prepare for you, a lot of links that we're able to provide. And this show is very much appreciative to the executive producers. Terry, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I'd like to say thank you to Oracle Buck Farmer, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Jay Widener, Oracle McHale, and Oracle the Crew of Erebus. Additionally, I'd also like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsek, Gargan Loire, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaymanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Pat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rolls. Thanks everyone for your support.
And if you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
And until next time, if you consider staring into the void to achieve godhood, please do it on your own time. Bye.